ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to leave the recommendations up and probably move forward in a minute to the way forward as well. My role is to try and manage for the next 25 minutes, I've got a bit less time than I'd hoped for, an interactive session. So I'm not going to make a long speech. I'm going to say a few words, though, just to give you a little bit of time to think. So please be prepared in the next 3 or 4 minutes to start asking some questions about what you've seen. I appreciate you've had a lot of information all at once, but it would be great to have some questions, comments, and observations from the floor. Before introducing the panel for the panel discussion and the team that will answer your questions and observations, I just thought I'd say a few short words to give you a bit of time to think, partly, but also because as CEO of Manipal City and Guilds, as one of the funders of the report, I owe myself a few minutes just to speak and tell you about why we funded it, or were part funded it. I've run a very tight ship for 3.5 years. As my colleagues will know, spent very little money, discretionary money, because we're in skill development and there isn't much to spend. But the reason we funded, or part-funded this report is because it's about employability. And all of us in skill development know that there's nothing more important than an outcome, and that outcome is employment. And the way to achieve employment is first to make somebody employable, then get them into employment, and only from that point on really can aspiration and job progression, livelihood progress. So this is really the starting point. We all feel very passionate about employability, and I think what was great about this piece of work was that we got heavily down on the ground to understand what's happening in the Indian context. We felt very strongly that we needed to understand specific job roles and what's happening on the ground with specific job roles in specific industries. And it's great to see that Manish and Emma Sue have created out of that deep, but yes, narrow research, some very specific Indian context recommendations, some of which were unexpected. You know, the Common Indian Framework of Reference was not necessarily something we understood would come out of this research as a recommendation. Yes, we came in with a preconception that there might be a need for an A0, but not that there might be a need for a CIFR. We also didn't know that we might need to look at separating out language, communication skills, and English from the qualification packs. And it would be interesting to get Praveen's view of that piece of work that may come. So with those few words, I just wanted to give you a little bit of time to reflect on these recommendations on the way forward. I'd like to welcome to the dais Manish Singh, co-author of the report. Manish. Praveen Roy, CEO of the Tourism and Hospitality Sector Skills Council. And Leighton Ernsberger, where are you, Leighton? There you are. Who's the Assistant Director of Skills for British Council. So time is a little bit less than we thought it might be. So I think we've covered really why the report was commissioned, what it is we were trying to achieve. And I think to a degree we've also covered what the report is suggesting, but clearly you've only just heard all about that. So I thought we would just do a little recap and then we'll open up to the floor so that we get a good 15 minutes of interaction. So if I could, Manish, I'd turn straight to you to ask about your views of the recommendation to develop a common Indian framework of reference. You know, why is that required? What will it achieve? And to a certain degree, how would we go about doing it?
I think firstly, and we all know the context of India with multilingualism, more than 39 languages which are recognized. Through this research, we've also come to know how different languages are used in the workplace. It is not necessarily English or just one particular language like Hindi. So people use multiple languages to actually carry out their work. It was very interesting when we looked at the CIFR and how it represents 39 languages. And we said, in India, there are certain places we went to, for example, in Odisha, where Bengali was considered more important for employment than English. Because primarily, the hospital that we were in, over there were more Bengali patients than people who would speak English. So the employer said, if somebody can speak Bengali, I would hire them more readily than somebody who would only know English. Similarly, we spoke to another young boy, a steward in Delhi, who had migrated from Odisha. And for him, Hindi was very important because it not only helped him get a job here in Delhi, but it also helped him accommodate himself better in the city, you know, the social accommodation that goes along with it. So we clearly recognize that there is a need to understand where, why, and how much of which language do we need in this country, and different contexts would demand that differently. And that's where the idea of the CIFR came in. We also, in our research, came across examples, for example, in Japan, who were trying to develop their own version of the CIFR for their requirements, and with a different number of levels than what are available in the CIFR. So we felt that it does not make sense, one, from a perspective of just importing something which exists already. I think people need to engage with the requirements in this context and, you know, use that to create the framework. And secondly, the benefit that we always see in doing things ground up or within the context is the amount of capacity building that helps in. You know, if you actually engage with something which is pre-made, a lot of times the learnings, the buy-in, the understanding of what that is not as well absorbed or developed within the stakeholders who are going to be using that. So just developing something ground up using, you know, stakeholders in the country who are engaging with it on a daily basis has benefits of its own. So that's where the idea of the CIFR came in. So I think it's extremely important. It is the way forward. Now, anybody who knows the Indian context and how things work here know immediately that it is going to be immensely complex to develop something which, you know, forget national, you know, that has a singular national framework, but even if you were to do it regionally or for a state or for a sector, it is going to be an incredibly complex activity. And this is one of the reasons why I think communication, bringing together stakeholders, you know, working this ground up is extremely important. And of course, we need to find agencies which would champion this, and that would mean that you'd need some amount of governmental and official status being accorded to this, but at the same time, national bodies would have to converge together to actually do this. So that's my initial.
Thanks very much, Manish. Praveen, I wanted to turn to the second recommendation, which is that language and competence in any English and other languages in the QPs to be separately levelled according to this common Indian framework of reference. As CEO of a Sector Skills Council, the big Sector Skills Council, you've created a lot of QPs, a lot of work was involved in that. What's your view of that recommendation, and do you agree that we should implement?
Thank you, John. In fact, you know, the whole exercise of developing qualification packs is not a very simple exercise. It's a comparatively very complex exercise. And actually, during the process of developing these packs, one realizes that, yes, the communication skills are very critical, but at the same time, the focus has always been on developing the generic skills and doing the work, or the functional skills as we call them. So up till now, most of the qualification packs do give a lot of importance on the functional skills, and there's a whole lot of generic skills which are also available in the qualification packs. We realized that specifically the English language skills, which are very critical to our industry, which the research has also shown, cannot be taught under the framework only, because if you look at the number of hours which are available to teach a QP, those are very limited in structure. So we need to have, I agree totally that we need to have a separate you know, system where we can teach the language, which could be at variable levels for a same qualification, NSQF level also. For example, if a steward is working in a 5-star hotel as compared to a steward working in McDonald's or maybe in a Indian fast food chain like Bicano, the level of English communication skills required varies, you know, varies a lot. And it's not just speaking English which is important, even in terms of the written, you know, communication skills or even reading communication skills, it plays a very critical role. So I firmly believe that we need to have a separate, you know, focus on developing, like the hotels have been doing for a long period of time. But then those are the star category hotels. But what happens to the For example, we are developing a very interesting QP which is called street vendor. Now the street vendor needs to communicate, and he needs to communicate with a lot of tourists to actually come and visit the city, and they want to try the street food of the city. So there itself, there is a level of little bit of language requirement which needs to be defined. So we cannot ignore that perspective that right from the lowest level, right even from the level 1, 2, or 3 to the highest level, the communication, the English speaking skills will play a very critical role for the growth and development of the industry. So I firmly believe that yes, a separate framework would be really, really helpful.
Thank you, Praveen. Thank you. And Leighton, finally, on the third recommendation, which is that the CIFR should include a pre-A1 level. What's your view of that? What purpose would it serve? How is it going to help the context?
Well, I can take the pleasure today of introducing you to a language learner who lacks confidence. The only Hindi phrase that I can say with any confidence is "Meri Hindi achi nahi hai." And I am one of those people who I know that as soon as I say something in Hindi, I am stumped by the answer. So I do understand, that being lost at sea, irrespective of whatever core competences I might have for my job and everything else. I come from the background of being a policymaker, so I do feel that it's important to think about, something other than the immediate requirements for the job. That's only part of what you need to do. So progression is really important. And I do think that something which was key in the UK was we created a national qualifications framework. It had 8 levels, but the most important level was the one we added afterwards, which was entry level. And entry level has entry level 1, 2, and 3. Entry level 1 is bottomless. The reality is when you talk about learning, you're talking about a very big spectrum. And if you don't cater to those first entering into learning at all, then I think frameworks can become very exclusionary. So for me, an A0 level, and I think all the points that Susan made about assessment is really important, because I think the fact that assessment get warped at certain parts of the framework are really important, and entry is the hardest one to assess. But the ability to assess and to reward is really important, actually. And I do know that as an aspirant Hindi language speaker, the more I could get to reinforce what I can do, it makes me more confident to try and achieve more. What I would say, though, is there is a policy trap. I mean, you put a framework like this in front of people, particularly from a government perspective, and the tendency is to fill the shelves. And that's, in some ways, the worst thing you can do. You don't always need, in every sector, to have that bottom shelf filled. You don't always need A0 for every job role that we are going to define a pack for. So, there will be jobs in healthcare, such as nursing or being a doctor, where your basic entry into work will be much higher. It will be B2, and you will never talk about an A0. But if you really want progression within learning, there are many other sectors where you need to recognize and positively recognize the skills that are needed for that first job. So I do think entry and progression are really important, and I think entry levels in A0 could really help that.
Last comment, Manish, then we'll open up to the floor.
The one other thing I want to mention is that we came across many cases where people in jobs felt that English was beyond their reach. And I think, A0 pitches in there very nicely because it gives them confidence that they can really learn. For some people, it was because of the background. For some people, it was because of their age. But I think that, if you give them an A0 level and help them taste some success, they also then feel confident of progressing further. So I think that is also absolutely essential. Yeah.
Thank you, Manish. So before we move on to the way forward, we've got about 5 minutes to talk about these recommendations. I would like to take questions from the floor. Sir.
Yeah, thank you, John. Sridhar Balan, worked for many years. I worked in publishing, worked for many years at Oxford University Press, and now with Ernsberger and a lot of projects in British Council. Interesting, Manish, and I'll take Alison's cue, and I will speak to Emma during the break. Interesting, the kind of sampling of these 3 industries, construction, healthcare, and hospitality. But the language requirements are very different, and it's in the nature of the job that you do. And one of the things that I like to single out construction is the large presence of migrant labor that we have. Of course, they are very much present in the unskilled sector, and I do not know whether that kind of came up as sampling, because I know the level 4 shuttering carpenter, because my wife is an architect and I know a lot about carpenters. But the unskilled labor, whose presence is very large in the construction, do not have access to any kind of language skills, and that would definitely be a very this thing to run across. There could be presence of American labor and hospitality for that matter. The other question specifically I wanted to ask was that if they had access to language school, then was there an aspiration to move out of the industry in which they were working? Use the language as a kind of catapult to not go up further, but actually to move out. And was there latent ambition in that? Yeah, thank you.
Manish.
Two things that I'd like to mention in response. I think firstly, there's a huge aspiration, and I think the 21 people that we spoke to, there's not a single hand which didn't go up saying, I don't want to learn language, or both English and being literate in their own language. Number two, I don't think there was so much desire to leave the industry as much as it was to grow further, or maybe do the same job in a better context, maybe in the formal sector or abroad, for that matter. And yes, we did speak to those people, that you're talking about, completely in the unorganized sector, and who not had any formal training. And yet, the training institute that we were at was very keen for not just professional purposes, but otherwise to support language learning and learning of other, essential numeracy and other requirements for these people. And they were actually grappling to find out what is the best model in which to do this. And one of the things that came across very strongly was these people couldn't even read safety signs around them. So it became absolutely essential to say that we cannot look at vocational, which a lot of people are doing now, is looking at vocational as an alternative to basic education. I think, it has to merge together. I don't think that you can just say that, just because we failed in large part of our schooling, let's look at vocational as an alternative route. I think you need to embed literacy, numeracy, and certain other key skills into this, including soft skills. And that's the point that I think Praveen also made in some ways, that we need a separate way to address this and recognize this, firstly, that it is as important as it is. Yeah?
In fact, I would like to add, specifically if you look at ITES, the BPO industry, actually if you look at the birth of the BPO industry was fueled by the hospitality industry, because hospitality graduates had a phenomenal exposure to the language. And I think that helped a lot for the BPO industry to grow. So yes, from the aspiration perspective, it would definitely add into the growth of the aspirations. And I think the industry should welcome that. Because I think it fuels, if the circulation of the people takes place, they move out, in and out of the sectors, there's a lot of positive growth which takes place within the sector. So I think we as an industry, we are very positive about this aspiration perspective.
I'm from the construction sector and the CEO of the construction sector. And since, my sector has been mentioned, so let me mention over there that it's not a very aspirational, sector, especially from level 1 to level 4. And most of the workers are at the bottom of the pyramid, whether in terms of the wages, whether in terms of the education or the aspiration. 2, you also have to look at the work environment. It's very rough and tough. And actually, there's no time for them to actually learn about English. And to give you a small little example, I ran a training of the trainers program where the national occupation standards, we were trying to drill down to these people and make them understand. And I made sure that the faculty goes over there and, at least 3 times tell them what is the national occupation standard. And when the assessment came and I interacted with these students, I said, have you understood? And they were all experienced workers. I said, did you read that bump which I handed over to you as a national occupation standard? They said, sir, there it is in English. We couldn't actually understand it. So that's the level at which they are. But then, we are looking at the people where this workforce, especially from level 4 to upwards, they get trained, and wherever the migration has to happen, English has to come through. 2, wherever you see that the job role requires them to interact with the customers, like what you are quoting as assistant electrician, because he has to interact with his customers, English, naturally, they will like to learn over there. Otherwise, I think it will take a certain amount of time, but definitely we will try and build up these soft skills so they learn English if they have to move up. And perhaps in the progression, we will make it mandatory in a certain amount of time to learn the language and move upwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I mean, what I would want to emphasise is, although we've titled the report English Skills, this is about language and communication skills more broadly. And so whatever language is being learnt or acquired is important. to employability and progression. So, but fully accept what you're saying, particularly about migration and where English language for construction workers becomes important. Other questions and comments from, yes, Vivek?
My name is Vivek Agarwal. I run a language learning platform company, Liquid. So there's this taxi driver I once spoke to who said he wanted to learn English language because he felt inadequate, small, when he didn't understand what people were saying when they sat in the back seat of his car, right? So for language, there is a whole aspirational thing apart from the job requirement, right? So would that sort of stuff be covered in a framework like this, or would you say there's a separate social sort of track? What's your view on that?
Manish first.
So if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're talking about people like taxi drivers looking at requirement of English for purposes other than really discharging their primary responsibilities. Yeah? So I think a framework gives you a logical manner of learning and how to scaffold on from one level to the next to the next. So it will apply to work contexts across, and each of these, if defined for within the sector, would possibly cover the requirement that you're talking of. If, for example, you look at the CIFR, they look at three distinct sort of categories: work, tourists, and study. So social and tourism and study. So they have descriptors for each one of these, and the levels actually address these requirements. So in some ways, it depends on how far you want to extend your effort. I'm sure it will evolve over time, but the first point where you want to start off is looking at primary responsibilities of work, and then build on to other areas of study and even beyond. So if you even look at the CIFR and the related documentation, it has evolved over a period of time. It is not that the first time it came out, everything was in place. Different agencies have sort of added on to making it more user-friendly, making it specific to context, adding bits for people's understanding and to use for different contexts. And the same thing will and should happen here. Thanks,
Manish. Brief comment, Leighton?
Sure. I mean, one point that I wanted to make about why we were talking about a parallel framework for languages is just to emphasize that importance that languages is one of those skills that can develop in parallel to whatever your personal work position is. So I think it's really important to understand that language learning is a very different form of structured learning than your vocational skills, which you will develop on the job and in a different sense. Because there is a tried and tested method of progressing your language abilities, it's good to assess within that context. I mean, one just quick thing that I would say about in the UK, we went through developing apprenticeships where certification for numeracy and literacy was embedded in the vocational qualification. We did that for a while, and the problem is we found that if you submerge certain transferable skills within a wider context, then it's very difficult to then pick up and progress within those skills. So we had to take back out again literacy and numeracy as a separate form of assessment, because what you really want somebody to be able to do is to not only progress in their role, but there are certain core skills, and I think language is one of them, where you need to be able to achieve for your job, but you also need to be able to continue to learn in a structured way to develop those skills as well as your job skills. And that's one reason why I would support the idea of parallel frameworks, because it gives you a very clear way to develop.
Thank you, Leighton. Any last points or questions on this?
My name's Pranav. I'm here on behalf of ISEC. I've actually had this idea for a while, and I think one of the things that's restricting people from picking up English or using English as something that can help improve their employability, for that matter, any language. As someone mentioned, in Odisha, it's useful to know Bengali, is I think, as a suggestion, because I know there are many people in this room involved in this industry, I think if we separate what a language is from the script, it's a very new, or I would say some would call a revolutionary way of doing things. Like today, if I have to note something down in Hindi, or if I'm preparing to meet a client and speak to him in Hindi, I am writing in Hindi, but I'm using the Roman alphabet. Now, I feel there are many situations in which students could be taught how to speak English by using, say, Devanagari or whatever script they're comfortable in. And I have improved my Hindi by using a Roman alphabet in order to write it or structure it or whatever. So I don't know what the audience or the panel's opinion on that would be, utilizing, separating language and script, so that, okay, like a construction worker may not understand you know, he may need to understand the script to know a safety sign. Whereas somebody who's a salesperson or a street vendor, it may be more important for them to be able to speak the language than read it.
I think you're making very good points. We are running short on time, which is unfortunate. But what is important in the report, I think, is that it will distinguish, you'll see, distinguishes between skills required in reading, writing, listening, speaking. So you're making a very good point. You know, the ability to speak in some roles will be more important than the ability to write or read, and vice versa, depending on the context. So I think that's a very important input, actually, that we should take back and think about further with the team. I'm sorry to close things down. Oh, yes, please. Yes.
I'm from Pratham, and we work with on quality issues of education. And just to corroborate what the gentleman just said, we are experimenting with that. Actually, we work in 19 states, which is quite large. I don't want to get into that. We do these projects to teach English in a different script. And there is an interesting project that is running in Kokrajhar. Michael, I don't know whether you know about this or not. Parasmita is doing it. Where multilingual, in a multilingual situation, children are being taught Assamese in their own sort of script, the script that they know. So this is something maybe you want to look at.
Thank you, we will. And ma'am, you had a question as well, or a point to make.
First of all, I would like to congratulate the team for doing a marvelous research. I'm Pankhuri, I'm from NSDA, National Skill Development Agency. My only concern here is, like, as we are already rolling out NSQF in the country, so my only concern here is like creating the whole, a new framework altogether can confuse the whole ecosystem. Because a lot of work has been done in NSQF, a lot of QPs, NOSs have been made, and I don't know how it will solve the problem. Because, a lot of resources are involved, a lot of like clearances from ministries maybe, will be required. So I don't know how do we address this. I mean, it should not confuse the whole ecosystem of NSQF. That is my only concern.
Thank you, very good point, and a very key segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is how we take this forward. If we believe these are some of the right things to do, how do we do that? And will it actually disrupt the ecosystem? So maybe the three panelists could each make a comment on that point and about how, research is all very well, but it's only meaningful if we take some action as a result of it. So what do we do next? How do we take things forward? How do we bring together the stakeholders like NSDA, NSDC, sector skills councils, training providers and others to make this actually work?
Yeah. Two initial comments. Firstly, when you look at the NSQF gives you qualification levels. It does not give you progression of learning for different disciplines. So if you take any discipline, for example, if I were to actually go a little technical, an area we studied in quite detail, for example, welding, it has its own framework which is far more complex than what the NSQF can actually address in terms of learning requirements. You can benchmark qualifications to a level, but the learning requirements are completely different, and people who use the learning frameworks for disseminating this learning and assessments, etc., do it quite differently than what the NSQF would. You would assume the NSQF would need. So whether it's soft skills, whether it's English, there are parallel frameworks. You'll need frameworks for possibly every single discipline that you actually want to train people in, because the purpose is different. The purpose of the NSQF is to benchmark qualifications, whereas the purpose of other frameworks are how to progress learning. So you might club 3 levels of learning into 1 level of the NSQF framework possible. You might have 20 levels of progression within a particular discipline, but for qualification purposes, you might, plug them into 10 levels because the NSQF says so. So it is a complex but a parallel activity. It has nothing really to do with the NSQF's, benchmarking of levels. It's separate. Second, we are only telling people that the qualifications that you take, you have options to pick up the relevant language levels, with it. So, and like I said, frameworks evolve, the documentation that goes along with it evolves, the way it is operationalized evolves, and it will continue to evolve. It will never even stop. because the market requirement changes. So it's a lifelong sort of work that we'll keep on doing. It's a model, and the model will never accurately depict what reality is. So we constantly have to move around the model to adapt reality. We can't change reality to, meet the model. So it is required. It is parallel, and any domain would require it. So and in order how to bring together people, I think if firstly there is a will and recognition of the importance of this for employability purposes and for people's development purposes, then you cannot ignore it. You cannot ignore it, because without it, your plans won't succeed, especially this target segment that we have prioritized so much in this country. They would never be put on this path of lifelong learning, because even our research shows that for long-term career success, it is absolutely essential. And people who get stuck at levels feel frustrated and then either disrupt their profession or their work, are possibly victims of this fact that they are unable to progress beyond a certain level because of their lack of capabilities. So if we are committed to putting people on a developmental path to achieve employability and further progression, then there is no way where we can ignore this. We just have to innovate, constantly brainstorm, constantly communicate, and bring together people into understanding the requirements and adapt frameworks, create new frameworks, do everything that is required to meet the requirement. I think that's the priority. Yeah. So
I agree.
So the only bit that I'd sort of add on is just to say that I think there are times when policy needs to be disruptive, and there are times when policy should not. I think the NSQF is disruptive, and it needs to be, because the idea of standardizing and homogenizing learning such that you work on outcome-based learnings, that you work towards nationally defined standards, is the right first step, and that is the right disruptive policy to make. I think in terms of the CIFR, I wouldn't suggest that that should be a disruptive policy. It should only be one that grows up organically and in parallel. I think it should be set as an aspiration, not as a mandation. I think to continue work in parallel on defining a CIFR without disrupting is possible, and I think it's a worthwhile activity to do. And I think there will be opportunities, to implement also. So say, for instance, there's a move to approve a qualification pack for a job role, and you start to find that there's a fragmentation of that job role into multiple qualification packs, and the only difference is language. Because in this context they need English, because in this context they need another language, because in this context they need another national language. What you then need to do there is say, well, this is a good opportunity to say there is only one job role, but there is in parallel three different language requirements, because the context is different. Geographically it's here and geographically it's there. You take the opportunity when it presents itself, but you definitely don't force it onto other areas. So if you make it as an aspiration of policy and for work to go on, and to take opportunities when they arise to implement it, that might help it to grow more organically. And as Manish says, there's nothing to say that the CIFR came in perfectly in the first place. It didn't. And it does need to be in a situation where it can improve over time. So I would suggest it's an aspiration rather than a mandation.
Thanks. I'd completely agree with that, Leighton. A question at the back.
I think the question that lady asked from NSDA, even currently you have the NSQF framework and the educational framework running parallelly. There's no integration which is happening right now. Okay, that the integration which is going to happen going forward can always look at this framework which is going to run again parallelly for an integration at some parts of it into the national skills framework. Because NSQF is only job role based. It does not say, it addresses NOS as one of the soft skill areas where the language is sunk into it. It does not take you into the depth of it. If somebody has an aspiration to move from one level to the next level, irrespective of the role that he plays, because English language is something is not necessarily only for the workplace, but even on it can get into the social aspects as well. And therefore, somebody who has an aspiration to progress further, you can always have a parallel framework.
Thank you, sir. I'm very conscious of time. I apologise. I think we've got lots more questions and comments to come from the audience, including how do we assess an A0 level, lots of other debates that are required. But we have run out of time, so unfortunately we have to close. And hopefully you'll be able to ask some of these questions and have discussion over networking. So I'll pass over to the closing remarks. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Panel.